Welcome to The Good Life. In today's talk you're about to watch, we are going to discuss the question, who do you belong to? This is a deep philosophical question that at surface level seems easy to answer, but as we discuss it, Scott and I discuss it, I think you're going to learn and get a lot out of this first question. So sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Typically, that's a question maybe you get asked if you meet a new friend, like, where are you from? Or you meet a friend of a friend, and they ask the same thing. Typically, I think for students, it's like, what school do you come from? Maybe what neighborhood do you live in? If you go off to college, that's certainly like a topic of conversation, like, where are you from? Yeah. But generally, I think what people mean by that question is geography. Where were you born? Yeah. And how did that shape you? And that's kind of what we mean behind that question. There's actually quite a lot behind it. Where are you from? It's who are you from? How did it shape you? How did it influence you? And then there's a whole nother level. I don't know if we'll get into this, but like, what does that say about you? The fact that I'm from South Orange County, typically, especially with TV shows about Orange County, come up in people's brains like, oh, you're this certain person. And there's an element of truth to that, but it doesn't tell the whole story. So helping someone process it, for you to think about that question, where are you from, it's not necessarily apparent. And that's what we'll get into as we get on these questions. Like, there's kind of a surface answer, yeah, and then there's a deeper one.
Yeah, that's a great point. And as I, worked through these questions in my own life and started to jump into this, like, where do you come from? And I felt like there were, as you're getting to, like, yeah, almost like tiers, right, of like, okay, like, how macro am I gonna answer, yep, this question, into like how micro or detailed I answer, right, this question. And the other thing that I've always kind of looking through is, whether it's being a pastor, but really just a follower of Jesus, is, right, like, well, where do I come from, and kind of what's like the biblical, yeah, backing to that. Right. So there are kind of all, yep, these different almost steps you can, yeah, take. Yeah. And so depending on which one you're focusing on, that's why this question is like, you can spend a lot of time, right, on each of these questions, yep, but for sure this kind of where do you come from. And so I kind of looked at it just, even kind of as a two-part. One, like, where do I come, what does God say, where do I come from, yeah, in the biblical context, right. But then also I think whether we like this or not, and sometimes, yeah, this can be a little, it's like, who's your family? Like, right, whether you love your parents, right, or not, yeah, like, yeah, you come from them. that you come from them, you come, right, from the reality that, like, whatever life they provided, like, you receive that. Yep. And for a lot of us that's amazing, and for, right, some of us that's difficult, but, yep, regardless, that absolutely shapes, yeah, who you are, your future, your story, how, right, you communicate. And so, yeah, I don't know if you want to share a little bit about what you think, mm-hmm, of those two, or,
yep,
yeah.
Well, maybe first we'll hit the biblical part of it, because I don't think there's a Bible verse that I can think of where, yeah, it says you need to know where you come from, or else. Like, there's no warning, there's no commandment about it, but it does seem to be important to the writers of the Bible. I think the one example, though, that's kind of different would be the story of Jesus. It's kind of weird because we know, yeah, where he comes from. We got like the Christmas story, yes, but then there's really like 30 years where we don't really know the backstory to who Jesus was. And different people try to fill in the gaps over the years, carpenter, stonemason, but we just don't know that much. All the other characters, though, it's hard to think of another character where their backstory, where they come from, isn't important. Thinking of guys like Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament, he always talks about where he came from. Yeah. Think about all the kind of big figures of the Old Testament. Moses, he was raised by the Egyptian royalty. Abraham, there's just like a series of people and characters where they come from is incredibly important. And then typically there's a moment, an interactive moment, where God steps in and it almost says, like, despite where you come from, or in spite, I'm not sure what the difference is. Yeah. I'm going to do something new, but it's also going to flow from that. Mm-hmm. So I think a point there is we can't disregard our backstory. It matters to who we are, where we're going, and who we're turning into.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's such a great point, because obviously we're all trying to be like Jesus, and
Yeah.
and that's kind of the focus. But there is, even like you said in the Bible, there's not the same clarity as a Moses, where
Right.
it's like I actually participated in this challenge in January to try to read the Bible in January, which
Whoa.
yeah, it was intense. But in doing so, I got through the Old Testament. That's really all I got through,
Yeah,
the Old Testament.
yeah.
And in doing,
pretty legit,
yeah, and I
Good job.
flew through it. Like, anyway, but in doing so, you're right. You see this like lineage is really important.
Yeah,
Like where
yeah,
you
yeah.
like the
Right.
line in which you
Yep.
come from. And I know
Yep.
we could debate about, and we're not gonna, but about New Testament, Old Testament. But
Right.
there is something to be said for knowing where you're come from.
Yeah.
And I love what you said of God having this kind of intervening or coming
Right.
to moment.
Yep.
And I know for me in my story, like I was blessed, whatever you want to call that, to be born into kind of a Christian home where my
Yep.
parents valued Christ and valued those things. But there was this distinct that moment, even for like where my dad was kind of God to me in my understanding.
Right.
Like, you know, he image of God, he's kind of the representing that. But by the time you're in junior high, if not sooner, you realize your parents are human, they make mistakes, yada, yada, yada. And then as you get even older, that whole like making your faith your own, if you grew up
Yeah.
in kind of a faith context, it's like my earthly dad is, of course, my dad, and a great example, and a lot of the things he did in life is very much a good example of who
Yeah.
God is. But he's not God.
Right.
And my earthly father, who I kind of looked at as God's, that transition, God intervening to
Yeah.
go, no, I'm your father, I'm your
Right.
heavenly father, and that transition happens, I think, in all of us, at least if you kind of grew up with
Right.
the Christian family.
Right. And I didn't. I came from a family that was really tight and loving, but we had zero. There was like zero. Not once did I ever go to church. I didn't know, even going into college, didn't know a thing about anything. And when I I'd say, bumped into a Christian community, kind of randomly started hanging out with a bunch of Christians, and I got really curious, there was a moment for me right about when my parents got divorced, which for me was like I was 20 years old. And I had a similar but maybe more extreme version of that isn't my God. And I made a strong break for, I want to know where I really come from, because where I come from isn't serving me anymore. And I know there's a lot of kids probably with families that are not intact, not together. There's some brokenness there. And there's a question, like, does the broken parts of where I come from, does that have to define me? Does that have to predict where I'm headed? And then I think the other part of that is a lot of us in kind of growing up, it didn't go that well. There were some bumps and bruises and some hurt. And so there's also kind of a swirling question. Does that predict a future that isn't bright and isn't good, or in the context of this, isn't meaningful? So there's just a lot to unpack there, to your point. There's just a lot of layers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just love the fact that I think just having this question,
Yeah.
asking
Yeah.
it, and there's no right answer. It's just
Yep.
like you
Yep.
need to dive into that question for yourself and begin to ask that question. And I know for me, and I don't know about you, as I work through questions like this, I kind of start jotting things down and that
Yep.
I think, and then I do ask people that I trust that are around me to go, how would you answer this even for me?
Yeah, right.
Because that lends to such a
Totally.
unique perspective.
Yeah.
Because so often we think something plays out a
That's
certain
right.
way, but
Yeah.
it's good to get
Yeah.
the different angles.
Yeah, we see things through kind of one lens, and it's helpful, to your point, to have different kind of almost three dimensions. Probably 2-3 years ago, we sort of lost our family videos from when I was a kid, or I couldn't find them. And then it turns out my dad had them all along. And when he moved, he took them. And so 2-3 years ago, I forget when, he sent them all to me that he kind of converted to DVD. And all of a sudden I'm watching the tape of what actually happened. And I have to tell you, my memory of childhood was different, like kind of fixed up to that point. Like there wasn't a lot of love. I just had this sort of story that I created. And then I'm literally watching the tape, and I'm like, and I kept saying in my head, I was wrong. I was wrong. I'm now seeing it, and there's like kind of two realities trying to merge. So asking the question's helpful, even having this question.
Yeah.
taking it a few layers, inviting other people into it. And there's just something about writing, there's something about talking things out, and there's something about listening to other people talk about you and your story, that in those three things, thinking, talking, listening, you can actually get to more and more clarity if you pursue it.
I hope you enjoyed our discussion on who do you belong to. Take some time to dive into that question. Ask some friends, dialogue, maybe write in your journal about who you belong to. I guarantee that if you begin to really answer that question, you will be on your way to a more meaningful life. If you'd like to get more information on Scott or myself, go ahead and follow us on Instagram and check out theuschool.com. We'll see you in the next video.